1978, Beidao, Huang Rui, and Meng Ke crisscrossed the capital, checking all the places where they had posted today. Everywhere they found knots of people crowded around their pages, discussing them aloud. They had put up extra pages so people could leave their comments anonymously if they wished, but there had been no need. People talked openly because, miraculously, for those few brief months, they were no longer afraid. It was the first time they had heard their words in the mouths of strangers. It was exhilarating. For more than 10 years they had held on to the sound of their real selves, the voice deep inside of them, even as they were forced to chant slogans day after day. Theirs was a generation that had plunged from the heights of idealism, of a fervor perhaps only a teenager can feel, to the depths of disillusion. Cynicism ran through them like a scar, and yet somehow they had protected inside themselves something real. This is what they offered up in the pages of today. When these three had sat down to choose what they would publish in the very first issue of their magazine, they knew they had no right to expect it would last beyond its first printing. It was possible that they would be arrested before they ever printed a second issue. And so, for that first and possibly last edition, they each chose a kind of personal manifesto. Huang Rui's was a manifesto in color. He knew he was an artist, not a poet, and his statement was the cover of today. An image of two young people breasting the tape in a race for a new world, an image rendered in the color of the boundless sky. For Meng Ke, his manifesto would come in the form of a poem about the transformative power of poetry itself. I am a poet. I am a rebel shadow. Let it be ripped to bits, so the blood dripping down can reflect a patch of light. I am a poet. I am the sheet of blood-stained paper. Let it be passed around and read, so that the hearts are closely linked. I am a poet. I am history's witness. Beidao's poem, The Answer, was destined to become one of the most influential in contemporary Chinese history. 10 years after it first appeared in Today, its lines would be emblazoned on students' banners as they rallied in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Beidao had written it soon after the events of Qingming, 1976. The most famous stanza of The Answer reads, Let me tell you, world, I do not believe. If 1,000 challengers lie beneath your feet, count me as number 1001. It was a whoop of defiance that would become an anthem for a generation. His confidence in the face of the crackdown on the Qingming demonstrations in 1976 would echo again 10 years later, even as the tanks patrolled the streets of Beijing after the bloody crackdown of June 3rd through 4th, 1989. It proclaimed a belief that, in the end, however long it would take, history was on their side, on the side of the youth and those who opposed, not those who oppressed. His poem assured them that it was they who were the inheritors of China's long history, not those who ruled from the inside of the red walls of the new forbidden city, Zhounanhai. A new conjunction and glimmering stars adorn the unobstructed sky now. They are pictographs from 5,000 years. They are the watchful eyes of future generations. When the authors of today were later denounced, their work would be condemned as incomprehensible, misty, and spiritually polluting, lacking in the patriotic flourishes that the authorities deemed realistic. What the authors' critics really hated, of course, was how realistic the work actually was, how recognizable to their generation. During the Cultural Revolution, some 17 million urban youths had been sent away from their homes to learn revolution from workers and peasants in the countryside. What they learned instead was how much they had been lied to. There was no socialist utopia out there. There were no farms and factories full of apple-cheeked, smiling souls serving the revolution. Instead, there was poverty, exhaustion, frustration, and the all-too-fresh memory of famine. It was 1969 when the teenaged Beidao, Meng Ke, and Huang Rui left Beijing to be re-educated. At the time, they knew nothing of each other, and they were bound for different places. Huang Rui traveled north to the bleak expanses of Inner Mongolia, while Meng Ke hitched a ride on a horse cart south to the marshlands of Bayandiang Lake in the neighboring province of Hebei. Beidao traveled further south to work construction on an electrical generation plant some 300 kilometers from Beijing. But while they were away, Each began to write poetry, even Huang Rui, who later gave it up for art instead, and it was through writing that they would find each other. So who were they, these three who made history in that brief Beijing spring? Beidao was the aristocrat among the three, tall, thin, and naturally serious. His upright carriage could even make his Mao suit look smart. He had grown up within a charmed circle in Beijing, his father high up in administration, his mother a doctor. His parents had sent him to the best schools in the capital, where he rubbed shoulders with the children of the political elite. Yet, as a teenager, he chafed against his privilege. He found his prestigious school stifling, and was hopeless at the subjects like mathematics and science that they prized. When the Cultural Revolution began in 1966, he needed no persuading to become a Red Guard. He escaped school and ran wild for the next 3 years with his Red Guard troop, as they scraped with other factions and rampaged through the city. He led raids on public libraries and on the homes of people who had, only a short time before, been part of the honored elite. At first, he and his friends followed the correct Red Guard line. They were there to destroy books that smacked of bourgeois liberalism, art, poetry, foreign and ancient literature. All of these should be rooted out and burnt. If they must carry things away, they should loot only books on war and revolution, choosing the kinds of titles they thought likely to meet with the approval of Chairman Mao himself. But soon Beidao and his friends found themselves searching instead for what was forbidden: Western literature in translation, or Chinese classical culture, building a secret library that they would draw on in the years ahead. Beidao was only 19 when he was sent away, and he was almost 30 by the time he broke cover with his writing in Today. But in the intervening years, he had devoted himself secretly to the vocation that he discovered almost as soon as he arrived on that desolate construction site 300 kilometers from his home in 1969, to honor the experience of his generation as a writer. Manker was born to wear a leather jacket. Unlike Beidao, who wore his Mao suit with scrupulous correctness, Manker slouched in his, pushing his hands deep into his trouser pockets till his jackets bloused up around his waist, like Bob Dylan making his way down a windy street in New York on the famous album cover. And like Dylan, Manker was a boy from the North Country. He had been born in the industrial city of Shenyang, deep in that part of China once known as Manchuria. At the age of 6, his family moved to Beijing, but he carried with him ever afterwards something of the toughness of his hometown. Shenyang remains the capital of China's heavy industry, and it was once a real capital as well, the last base of the Manchus before they crossed the Great Wall to take Beijing and found the Qing dynasty in 1644. Manker is not a Manchu, but he has never lost the air of an outsider, nor the glamour that allowed him to wear a Mao suit coat as if it was a flying jacket. In the Baiyang marshlands, where he went in 1969 at the age of 18, he quickly gathered around him a group of exiled youths who, like him, aspired to write. Over the following years, even as they remained underground and unpublished, the poets of Baiyang marshes became famous within a secret network of youngsters throughout the country who circulated poems and stories in handwritten copies. Beidao sought Manker out in those years in the marshlands, as did their contemporary Chen Kaige, who would later become one of the great filmmakers of the new generation, directing Yellow Earth and Farewell My Concubine, and winning the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 1993. In those years, all sorts of forbidden books circulated, many in translation that had, bizarrely, been authorized for private study within the Communist Party by Madame Mao herself. They were meant to stay within this charmed circle of cadres, but inevitably they leaked out, were pirated and passed from hand to hand. Of all these books, perhaps, the most important of these exiled youths was a translation of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, and of the three friends, it was Manker who best embodied the spirit of that counterculture classic. While Beidao was a natural writer and Huang Rui was an aesthete, Manker was a born bohemian. He was the only one among them who seemed to have found something truly beautiful in exile, discovering a rough beauty in the marshlands and the villages that spoke to his native sensuality. Years later, when he wrote a novel about his experience, he called it Wild Things, puzzling readers long inured to bitter descriptions of Cultural Revolution exile with his accounts of a bucolic world of sex and misbehavior. He has never lost that slouching walk, even now when he's had a real leather jacket for more than 30 years and his hair is completely gray. His hooded, rather languid eyes have never faded, nor his outside glamour. Huang Rui, on the other hand, would have looked like an intellectual no matter how he wore his Mao suit, tall and thin, with studious glasses and a soft-covered book rolled into one of his coat's patch pockets. His suits drooped like a scholar's robe. He was the youngest of the three. He was only 16 when he went to Inner Mongolia, full of dreams of art, literature, and music. Huang Rui's dreams were secret ones that would have scared his parents. His father had studied engineering on the campus of what is now Peking University. He had had dreams, too, founding his own factory in the year Huang Rui was born in 1952, when the People's Republic was young. But in 1956, the factory had been compulsorily acquired, along with all the private property in the nation, in the year every Chinese schoolchild knows as the date on which capitalism supposedly died. Gradually, Huang Rui's father was stripped of authority, until in 1959 he was reduced to the status of a simple worker in the factory he had once owned. If ever there was a Chinese generation who was destined to dismiss the experience of their parents, it was Huang Rui's. For all that he respected his father, he would be looking for guidance elsewhere. He would seek it inside himself, in the books he discovered secretly, and in the friends he would share them with. Meeting Beidao 2 years after he was exiled from Beijing would be a turning point. In the older and more confident young man, already committed to his life as a poet, Huang Rui would recognize something of himself. They would be friends for life, and through Beidao he would meet Meng Ke. At the time, none of the three could imagine how influential they would become. Years later, when China's most famous dissident, Liu Xiaobo, winner of the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize, was writing about what influenced him most deeply in his formative years, he cited the poetry of Beidao, Meng Ke, and the art of Huang Rui. Despite all the ways in which they differed, on that day in 1978 when the three of them posted the first issue of Today on the gray walls of Beijing, there was one thing they all agreed on. They wanted nothing to do with politics. Their revolution would be personal. They had spent years burrowing inside themselves to find what, despite years of indoctrination, was still real. They didn't want to follow leaders anymore. They wanted to put their faith in themselves. And yet, for all that they tried to avoid politics, it would run through everything they did. Because even to attempt to avoid politics in those days was a political act, and however much they wished to avoid it, politics would find them in the end. But that was a realization that lay ahead of them. In their first editorial, they wrote, "As the dawn rises from the bloodshed, we need colorful flowers, flowers that truly belong to nature, flowers that truly blossom in people's hearts." Flowers might seem an odd preoccupation for three harbingers of the avant-garde, but these were people whose whole lives had been dominated by propaganda. Literature and art had been harnessed to it. The idea that a flower could just be a flower meant everything to them. Politics had destroyed so much of what was beautiful and splendid in their country, and, even in their short lifetimes, it had killed millions of people. Politics had sent them away from their homes in their teens, had made reading and writing dangerous pursuits, had twisted people's brains so much that they hardly knew how to recognize what was real. Today would stand against politics, because the cold fact was that politics had made a mockery of their idealism. When they had gone to the country in 1969, they had still believed in Mao and his revolution. Even Huang Rui, who nursed secret doubts, had been captivated as a child by his country's revolutionary imagery of rockets heading for the skies and trains decorated with red flags streaming into the future. All three had been Red Guards. Even Huang Rui had gone to Tiananmen Square to be blessed by the chairman in the summer of 1966. They had stood in the square under the August sun, beating the sky with their little red books. They had swayed in a sea of teenagers all dressed alike, as Mao celebrated their role in his great proletarian cultural revolution. Whatever they felt over the next 3 years of that revolution, of the pitched battles, the looting and destruction in the capital, they still went to the countryside, trusting that once there, they would find the socialist paradise they had been told so much about. But they only discovered that politics had made fools of them. Of all the events that eroded their faith in the party, few had a more corrosive effect than the strange episode known as the Lin Biao incident. A brilliant military commander, Lin Biao was a key architect of the Communist Party victory over the National Forces in the civil war that ended with the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949. He became a crucial ally of Mao Zedong and was named as his designated successor in 1969. Few figures in the party's leadership were more respected. Then, in September 1971, Lin was killed in a plane crash in Mongolia in circumstances that to this day remain a mystery. Whether he had planned to assassinate Mao and then tried to flee to the Soviet Union, the official story, or was running away because he feared a purge, the impact was devastating for the party. The first official reaction was silence, but word of that event quickly leaked over radio broadcasts from Mongolia. That was how Huang Rui found out. Listening to foreign broadcasts was illegal, so naturally he, like tens of thousands of other curious young people, did just that every night. Even as the news ricocheted around the world and the Soviet Union sent experts to their client state of Mongolia to examine the crash, no official statement came from the Chinese capital. It would be a month before party cadres around the country were called to secret briefings to be told the official story of Lin Biao's treachery, and another month before that tale was made public. The Chinese people were accustomed to political reversals of fortune. They had nodded at the downfalls of plenty of once powerful men. But Lin Biao, as they heard the news for the first time, almost every one of them had a little red book in their pocket. And now they were being asked to believe that the person who had assembled that Bible, the man whose name and words were on its frontispiece, was a traitor. And not just a traitor, but a man who had chosen the hated Soviet Union as his refuge. Over the years following Lin Biao's fall, the Chinese government would try again and again to massage this story to make it more plausible and less damaging. Later, they would find Lin a convenient scapegoat for all sorts of excesses of the revolution. But for many ordinary Chinese, the fall of Lin Biao was the end of innocence and the beginning of cynicism. In the poor southern province of Guizhou, the students at the local school in the small town of Duyin had grown used to being asked periodically to hand in their history textbooks to their teachers and have them returned a little later with pages missing. Down there they had no money for new books, and so, page by page, they saw hero after hero ripped from the official account. "We saw Marshal Peng Duhai and Deng Xiaoping removed this way," one of these students recalled later, "and then President Liu Shaoqi. But then we were asked to hand up our books to remove all traces of Lin Biao." He told me that the moment when he ran his finger down the ragged inside spine of his textbook, from which his teachers could no longer be bothered to even remove the pages neatly, was the moment that he decided he would never again place faith in official history. The student's name was Guo Jian, and we will meet him later in this story. In the autumn of 1971, as the Communist Party cleaned up after the Lin Biao incident, they probably did not recognize how deeply the event had wounded them. Madame Mao rallied her fellow members of the Gang of Four into a campaign to criticize Lin Biao and criticize Confucius, and the population seemed to respond. But under the surface flowed a new mood, one that would explode at the Qingming incident in 1976 and then find full expression at Democracy Wall. Years later, the now imprisoned dissident and Nobel Peace Prize recipient Liu Xiaobo would remember the Lin Biao incident as the moment when his generation first began to think for themselves. On the day before Beidao, Huang Rui and Meng Ke rode through the streets of Beijing, posting copies of Today on the city walls in December 1978. The Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party concluded a key meeting in the capital. Deng Xiaoping had finally triumphed, clearing the way for his grand experiment in the reform and opening up of China. His ascendancy had been given a major push by events at Democracy Wall. The fervor could have been made for him. Posters were denouncing his rivals and calling for the rehabilitation of his allies. Democracy Wall also demonstrated what he had been arguing behind closed doors, that the country was ripe, indeed clamoring for change, and something must be done to harness energies that could run out of control. Since his return to Beijing in 1977, Deng had pushed for the rehabilitation of exiled and imprisoned intellectuals and officials, not just those who had suffered during the Cultural Revolution, but also those whose persecution dated back as far as 1957, when Mao had cracked down on a period of open liberal debate by launching the anti-rightist campaign. Deng was looking to gather around him the kind of people who could implement his pragmatic vision for the future of China. He saw a path to recovery for China in opening up to Western know-how and technology. He had seen during his time in the countryside what could be achieved by granting some level of autonomy and personal responsibility. Deng was no Democrat, and he would have been appalled by some of the sentiments being expressed at Democracy Wall. But when the United States reporter Robert Novak asked him in November 1978 for his opinion of what was happening there. Deng endorsed it, knowing he was sending a message. He had a date with President Jimmy Carter in January 1979, and he had no intention of spoiling the image of the newly open society he planned to promote. The United States should have no fear of sharing its expertise, its university places, and its money with China. When his remarks to Novak reached people at the wall, the news was greeted with wild cheers, even though Deng had also cautioned that he did not personally agree with all that was being said there. That night, thousands marched from the wall to Tiananmen Square in triumph, chanting, "Long live the people! We want freedom! We want democracy! Carry forward the April 5th movement." The April 5th movement was the label the Democracy Wall activists gave themselves as inheritors of the spirit of the Qingming demonstrations 2 years earlier. Deng would ride the energy of the witness of that day and use their passionate Democracy Wall while it suited him. Later, he would put them down without compunction. It is now commonly said that it was Deng Xiaoping who sparked China's modern reforms. But there is an argument to be made that the biggest push for change came not from above, but from below. As Liu Xiaobo wrote on the 30th anniversary of the events at Democracy Wall, people like Meng Ke and Bei Dao changed China by galvanizing the latent energy of the population. These spontaneous popular forces for reform, he wrote, were rooted in the human longing for freedom and justice, not some slogan of the rulers, and once they got going, they were hard to turn around. Now firmly in control of the government, Deng honed his message and used it to marshal confidence in his new policies. He endorsed an old slogan of Mao's, which was itself taken from a traditional Chinese saying dating back to the 1st century. As they plotted their path into the future, Deng said the Chinese should seek truth from facts. This slogan would become his mantra, repeated endlessly to indicate that pragmatism, not ideology, was now the watchword. As a slogan, it did not soar, but it worked. For farmers around the country, it promised a return to some autonomy, and over the following decades, it would revolutionize their lives. To technocrats and intellectuals, it seemed to say that in the future it might, in an old inversion of the old Maoist phrase, be better to be expert than read. And for a while it chimed with the people at Democracy Wall, too, the poets and the artists of today, and the bolder aspiring reformers such as Wei Jingshen. For wasn't that what they themselves were doing, honoring what they believed to be true, rather than the received truth of ideology? And for the 17 million young people who had been sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution, it seemed to promise a return to normality, a chance to come home and get on with a life they could choose for themselves. For some, it would even promise a chance to go abroad. As Deng got on the plane to the United States in 1979, Huang Rui and his friends were determined to push things as far as they would go. For Huang Rui, that meant seeking out a band of brothers who could do for art what today had done for literature. For now, his painting of liberty, his secret tribute to the spirit of Qingming 1976, was hidden under a sheet in his bedroom. But its time was coming. Chapter 3. The Stars. On the first day of 1979, a joint communique established full diplomatic relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China. The détente reached between President Nixon and Mao Zedong in 1972 was bearing fruit under the presidency of Jimmy Carter. On January 28th, Deng Xiaoping boarded a plane for the United States. His visit, so vital to a strategy of securing American knowledge and investment, was a resounding success. A series of powerful images defined Deng Xiaoping's trip. Deng applauding the Harlem Globetrotters at the Kennedy Center. Deng admiring the astronaut training facility at NASA. Deng chatting amiably with President Carter and former President Nixon at the official reception at the White House. Deng had insisted that Nixon be invited to the party, and the sight of him at ease with two such powerful figures enhanced the message of his ascendancy back home. But the moment that captured the most attention in both countries was when the diminutive Deng, who was only 4 feet 11 inches tall, donned a huge Texan hat at a rodeo outside Houston. There was something about the ease of the gesture, his ability to have fun with something that could have made him look ridiculous, that confirmed him as being both comfortable with the West and effortlessly in charge. Today, visitors to the National Museum of History in Beijing will search in vain for any meaningful mention of the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward, but they will find, in its own sealed display case, that Texan hat. For President Carter, though, it was Deng's performance behind closed doors that left the deepest impression. At a specifically convened private meeting, Deng coolly outlined China's plan to launch a military strike against Vietnam. He was dispensing with the decades of mistrust, taking the United States into his confidence and inviting its tacit support for what he believed was a common goal, to curb Soviet influence in Asia. China had always regarded its fellow communist state of Vietnam as a little brother, but a series of incidents had soured their relationship. Incursions into China along their common border were increasing, and ethnic Chinese in Vietnam were being expelled from the country. In late 1978, Vietnam shocked China by signing a treaty with the Soviet Union, and a month later compounded their offense by invading Cambodia, a regional ally of China. Vietnam argued that the invasion was imperative in order to oust Pol Pot, whose genocidal regime had turned Cambodia into a charnel house and was threatening Vietnam's own security. But to China, the Vietnamese action was brazen interference by a Soviet pawn in China's sphere of influence, part of a Soviet plot to encircle China from the south. Deng told Carter that China planned a limited punitive campaign to pull Vietnam into line. Carter, just 3 years on from the United States' humiliating withdrawal at the end of the Vietnam War, counseled Deng about the dangers of a military and public relations calamity. But he stopped short of opposing the plan outright, and Deng flew out of Washington determined to go ahead. The Army was his power base, and he was concerned at how much its involvement in the 10 chaotic years of the Cultural Revolution had cost it, both in training and respect. It was a long time since it had mounted a serious military campaign, and Deng thought that the action in Vietnam would give the Army a chance to come back into its own. It proved to be a massive miscalculation, one of the few that Deng was to make during his time in power. On February 17, 1979, waves of Chinese troops crossed the border into Vietnam, attempting the kind of shock and awe that had served them so well, if so bloodily, in the Korean War 29 years before. But China's tactics failed to draw the Vietnamese army north to fight, nor did the Vietnamese command move any of their forces out of Cambodia. Instead, battle-hardened Vietnamese militias mauled the Chinese, using the guerrilla tactics they had perfected in their long wars with the French and the Americans. Within days of the invasion, both sides had suffered heavy casualties. By the time China began to withdraw on March 6, they had neither forced Vietnam out of Cambodia nor demonstrated China's military superiority. The main phase of the war was over within a month, but the border skirmishes would continue for the best part of a decade. Before hostilities formally ended in 1989, thousands of Chinese soldiers would lose their lives and tens of thousands would be injured. China's official announcement of the conflict was only made once China's troops had completed their withdrawal on March 17th, and foreign journalists found themselves scrambling for information and seeking out any sources with Army connections. The Democracy Wall activist Wei Jingshan was one, and he happily shared what he believed to be common knowledge with at least one journalist. It was a decision that would cost him dearly. In early 1979, the voices at Democracy Wall were multiplying and organizing, even as rumors of a crackdown began to spread. When Deng Xiaoping returned to China, the wall was barely 3 months old, but already dozens of unofficial magazines and several other walls acting as platforms for dissent had appeared around the country. While Today remained strictly a literary magazine and avoided political discussion, many of the new publications were different. A friend of Huang Rui by the name of Liu Qing published April 5th Forum, which adopted the stance of a respectful advisor to the government. Liu believed that they had Deng Xiaoping's support and advocated a gradualist approach to political change. Wei Jingshan had no time for gradualism. In January 1979, he launched Explorations, which was by far the most radical publication to appear at Democracy Wall. The journal posed deep and uncomfortable questions. Why was China still so poor despite 30 years of communism? Why were women so exploited? Why were there so few opportunities for ordinary people to live a meaningful life? And, in a provocative foray into investigative journalism, Wei published an exposé of conditions at China's most infamous political prison, Qingchen. Nobody who was in Beijing during that extraordinary year of 1979 has ever forgotten it. The universities, which were deserted wastelands during the Cultural Revolution, had come alive again. Restored, too, were the teachers, many of whom had been brutally persecuted during the Cultural Revolution. A young People's Liberation Army, PLA officer, an aspiring artist named Hu Ming, arrived back in Beijing on furlough in the spring of 1979 and was intoxicated by what she found. During her service with the PLA, she had had her share of challenges and excitement. She had ridden the meadows of the far western Turk-speaking province of Xinjiang on horseback and had gone into the earthquake-ravaged city of Tangshan as a documentary filmmaker in 1976. Yet, even 30 years later, when asked to write about life in the capital in 1979, she couldn't contain her excitement. "Beijing in 1979 is an eternal spring in our memory," she wrote. "Dancing in the spring rain were many young hearts. They were manic, free, and pure." She listed all that was new, strange, and exciting that spring: portable tape recorders, foreign film weeks, the music of Jean-Michel Jarre, leather jackets, Frédéric Chopin, dancing with boys, and queuing all night for tickets to Swan Lake. Most exciting was that the capital seemed to be full of young people like herself who dreamed of creating art. Everywhere, at cross streets and at the railway station, at the long-distance bus station, you would find groups of people riding bicycles or walking with painting gear strapped to their backs. She was finding a whole world of kindred spirits who had been invisible before. She soon entered the orbit of today, as her best friend Xiao Fei had met Beidao and fallen in love. Meanwhile, Hu Ming realized her own dream by securing a place at the art school in the nearby port city of Tianjin. But as she remarked wryly later, it was those artists who didn't get into art school, people like Huang Rui, who would prove to be the masters of her generation. Huang Rui had sat at the entrance exam for the prestigious Central Academy of Fine Arts, but missed out. So he continued his art education as he started it, ferreting out art books in libraries and tracking down retired painters to be his mentors. Finally, he discovered an art course for workers at the Beijing Working People's Cultural Palace, east of Tiananmen Square. There he encountered another talent as passionate and iconoclastic as himself, a young man called Ma Deshang, who had contributed 2 woodblock prints to the first issue of Today. Ma's work was a million miles from the stock state-approved imagery of smiling workers and peasants. It had more in common with the stark version of German expressionists like Kata Kollwitz, a ferociously energetic figure who had spent a lifetime on crutches after suffering childhood polio. Ma Deshang was the ideal collaborator for Huang Rui. Both men had a vision for a new kind of Chinese art. Both kept works hidden away at home that needed to find an audience. Both were in search of others like themselves, who worked humdrum day jobs, but created art at night because it was the only thing they wanted to do. It was just a matter of finding them. As winter turned to early spring, barriers to artistic expression seemed to be melting away. But it was a different story for political dissent. In late March 1979 came a well-sourced rumor that, in a secret speech to the party leadership, Deng Xiaoping had called for a crackdown on Democracy Wall. In just a few short months, the wall had grown into something that, to the government, looked worryingly like an organized movement. Publishers of unofficial journals appeared to believe it was their right to be part of the reform process and were encouraging people to discuss political issues and problems themselves. In pursuit of economic reform, Deng was happy to harness the energies of intellectuals, scientists, officials, and even entrepreneurs, all of whom had been sidelined and humiliated during the Cultural Revolution. But political decisions, and even political dialogue itself, were to remain a matter for party control. Faced with the near certainty of a government crackdown, the Democracy Wall community split on the question of tactics. Wei Jingsheng wanted to denounce the government's plans in writing. Liu Qing, co-editor of April 5th Forum, counseled caution. Wei Jingsheng decided to go it alone. On March 25th, he returned to Democracy Wall to post what would be his final essay. Its title, An Urgent Question. Do we want democracy or a new autocracy? In it, he warned of the danger that Deng could become another dictator. History tells us, he wrote, that there must be a limit to the trust placed in any one person. 3 days later, new regulations appeared, banning any expression of opinion that did not adhere to the 4 cardinal principles: socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the leadership of the Communist Party, and Marxism-Leninism and Mao Zedong thought. The next day, Wei was arrested. It was a terrible blow which stopped most activists in their tracks. But even as a hammer came down on political dissent, China's painters, writers, and poets persisted in probing the artistic limits, and the response of the leadership was more tentative. Into this vacuum, Huang Rui and his friends were only too happy to venture. On a warm evening in May 1979, dozens of young people arrived at a dilapidated office building in eastern Beijing. The space was only 1.5 little rooms on the corner of a dusty courtyard behind a deserted Buddhist temple, but it was a symbol of the success of today. It was just 5 months since Huang Rui had ridden out across the snowy city to post the first issue of the magazine. Things had moved fast since then. Today was now being read all over the country. They were publishing 1,000 copies an issue, but that was only a fraction of their audience. Every day brought letters from readers recounting how they were sharing their single copy around a dormitory, an office, or a group of friends. Copies were being posted on notice boards and on other democracy walls, and being read aloud in parks and in homes. Every week brought contributions by young poets, writers, and artists from around the country. The magazine's office had originally been home to Liu Qing's mother, who had vacated it so that her newly married younger son would have somewhere to live with his bride. But the son insisted that the Today crowd, whom he idolized, should take the space instead. He moved into his university dormitory, while his wife stoically scoured the city for new digs. Manker slept in the half-room, his plank bed converting into a sofa for meetings during the day and into a desk for the mimeograph at printing time. The office quickly became a place of pilgrimage for young poets, artists, and dreamers. Tonight the place was crowded for a strategy meeting for an unprecedented event in the history of the People's Republic. They were planning an exhibition of work by the outsiders of Beijing's art world, a little band to whom Huang Rui and Ma Desheng had reached out, who reveled in the official no-go areas of art, the personal, not the political, the realistic, not the rosy, the experimental, not the traditional. The team that came together in the smoky room may have been untutored, but it was bursting with talent. There was Ma Desheng, who made angry, virile, technically masterful woodcuts; Qu Lei, whose fine ink portraits were rich with personal imagery; Yan Li, a new friend of Huang Rui's, who painted brightly colored takes on Cubism; and Wang Keping, whose powerful, politically pointed sculptures in scavenged hunks of wood were the very antithesis of safe official orthodoxy. As the meeting got down to business, their first decision was the name of their group. They would call themselves the Stars. The Stars? For a group of art school rejects? Actually, this wasn't a boast. It was a sly political joke with a touch of the poetic. They had all grown up being told that the only heavenly body that mattered was the sun, and the sun was Mao Zedong, whose solar radiance was celebrated in poems, songs, and paintings. Now, the great helmsman was gone. "Only when the sun has set," said Huang Rui, "can you see the stars." Their second question was where to exhibit. In Beijing in 1979, there were no private buildings. Even the Today office was unauthorized and technically illegal. You could hold a poetry reading in a park, and you could post a magazine on a wall. But an art exhibition needed a space of its own. To use a space, you needed a permit, and to get a permit, you had to be a member of the Artists' Association. But the Stars weren't members. That was the whole point of being the Stars. They eventually found a solution, and they would go on to mount their exhibition. But the whipsaw reaction of the authorities would expose divisions in the Chinese leadership over reform strategy. To some, taking the shackles off artistic expression was dangerous. It was all very well to liberalize the economy, but Democracy Wall had shown where free thought could lead. Should art be reined in as well? The turbulent way in which that question played out, and is still playing out today, assured the Stars a permanent place in history. The meeting determined they should seek out the chairman of the Beijing Artists' Association, Liu Xing, and ask for his advice. He might not be able to help them, but he would understand the delicacy of their position. Liu had spent a decade in jail after being trapped by Mao's infamous 100 Flowers movement in 1956. Mao had called for intellectuals and artists to engage in open discussion of the country's problems. Let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend. Mao believed that the discussion would find a natural center of gravity. After all, socialism was the only logical solution to human problems and contradictions, and finding new pathways to that conclusion would be a healthy thing. In the event, debates headed in directions that shocked the leadership with open discussions of the merits of democracy. Mao shut down the movement, but not before taking careful note of who had written what. Liu Xing was singled out in the anti-rightist campaign in 1957 and imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution. He was only rehabilitated after the return of Deng Xiaoping to the capital in 1977. So in the early summer of 1979, the stars met with Liu Xing and showed him their work. As an oil painter with a taste for the iconoclastic, he was excited by what he saw and immediately offered to help. But almost straight away it became clear that, despite Liu's goodwill, it would not be simple. Each of the 23 artists in the exhibition would need to declare their details, their occupations, and their political status in advance. And it would not be until the next year that they would be able to secure an official exhibition space, if at all. The stars felt they couldn't afford to wait. There were already too many omens that this exhilarating moment of liberty in their lives might be short-lived. Wei Jingsheng had been in custody for 2 months, and there was no word of his fate. Criticisms of the party had been outlawed, and Democracy Wall was now a gloomier, less edgy place. True, today continued to thrive, and every day new books, new music, and new people were turning up in Beijing. But, despite this, they could feel a chill in the air. So they decided, secretly, that they should move now and forget about a space. They would exhibit in the open air. The show would be in autumn, the capital's most beautiful season, and would coincide with China's National Day on October 1st, when the nation would be celebrating the 30th anniversary of the People's Republic. Then came the question of where to exhibit. Democracy Wall was too chaotic. The old Summer Palace, a melancholy ruin northwest of the city, had an atmosphere but was too remote. The forecourt of the China Radio Building at the far western end of Chang'an Avenue was perfect, except that it was a bastion of the propaganda ministry and would not tolerate them for a moment. And then they realized that the solution had been hiding in plain sight. They could show at the National Art Museum in the center of the capital. Come late September, the museum would have an official exhibition of Chinese art in honor of National Day. This would be the establishment's choice of the works that best represented that moment in history. The stars would display their counterpoint to this on the railings of a large garden just to the east of the building. They would open on September 27th and run for 1 week. As the day drew close, they began to spread the word among their friends, and then on September 26th, they rode out to the universities, through the city and to Democracy Wall, posting a notice calling on people to come and see the stars. September 27th was a perfect Beijing autumn day, which meant the weather was as beautiful as you could find anywhere in the world. The 23 artists gathered early, bringing their works on pedal carts and on the backs of bicycles, and then tying them to the garden railings with twine. Altogether, 150 works were hung that day. Huang Rui's secret painting of the year before was on display for the first time, dappled by sunlight shining through the trees. Beijing was a small place then. Most people lived within what is now called the Second Ring Road, which follows the course of the old city walls that were torn down in the 1950s. Within that perimeter, news spread fast. Office workers arrived with their shopping and their children in their arms. Students rushed there after school. People worked their way quietly, intently along the railings, examining each work in turn and stopping to read the Stars Manifesto. We, 23 art explorers, placed some fruits of our labor here. The shadows of the past and the light of the future overlap to form our multi-layered lives today. We live on with determination and remember every lesson we have been taught. This is our responsibility. A group of students gathered, laughing with shock at Wang Keping's sculptures. One piece, carved from the rung of a broken chair, showed a shrunken, distorted figure, its outsized arm and hand thrust towards the sky, brandishing a little book. Titled, "Long Live the Emperor," the work's target was unmistakable, as was the artist's contempt for the era it depicted. More visceral still was the work he called Silence. A carved face stared out, one eye blacked out, and a large wooden stopper in its mouth. Nearby hung a Madershang woodcut of a farmer and his oxen plowing a darkened field. The figures were tiny and exposed in a shaft of light under the gaze of a gigantic figure. It was titled Rest, and the irony was obvious. There would be no rest for the farmer this side of the grave. In interviews, Ma Desheng later made no secret of his anger at the party's hypocrisy over China's peasants. He had seen enough of rural life during the Cultural Revolution to know its grinding poverty, and to see it through the cant of urban cadres who glorified the peasantry, but whose own lives were paradise by comparison. The political edge to Huang Rui's work was gentler. Apart from his commemoration of the April 1976 Qingming demonstration, he had hung 2 paintings of the ruins of the old summer palace. Known as the Garden of Perfect Brightness, Yuanmingyuan, the palace complex stretching for 857 acres beneath Beijing's fragrant hills had been the favorite home of the Qing imperial family for 150 years. It was a place of legendary beauty, its Chinese-style pavilions and gardens interspersed with Italianate follies designed by the emperor's Jesuit advisors, complete with whimsical musical clocks and curly-cued marble archways. In 1860, French and English troops razed the entire complex at the height of the Second Opium War. The palaces were never rebuilt, and in 1979, the lonely ruins were an ambiguous witness to whatever version of history it seemed correct to subscribe to. Huang Rui painted the ruins repeatedly in 1979, each time investing the stones with something new. In the First Stars exhibition, he hung 2 paintings of the same stand of ruined columns, stark against the sky. In the first, which he called Last Will and Testament, the sky was a smoldering coal black, the sun blood red. In a second painting, the columns stood against a blue sky filled with clouds amid green pastures, and the shape of the columns had shifted slightly so they seemed like couples embracing in the sun. This painting he called New Life. Today, the Communist Party has preserved the ruin of the old summer palace as a reminder of the humiliation heaped on pre-revolutionary China by foreign powers. But in 1979, Huang Rui claimed it for his generation. The ruins seemed to show that you could survive utter destruction and, in the aftermath, find new hope. For a generation that had come through the Cultural Revolution, this meaning was clear. In a tree by the railings of the museum, Huang Rui had hung an old exercise book on a string with a pencil attached to a visitor's book in which the artists encouraged people to write their impressions of the works. That day, a person who called himself an elder wrote that in the paintings he found fresh and robust strength emerging from ruins amid rotten grass, young blood, bright colors, vibrant brushwork. "Ah," he exclaimed, "your art enlivens this old man's heart." When Liu Xing arrived, he was unperturbed by the stars' impatience and their cheek at exhibiting without permission. Surrounded by a crowd, he toured the exhibition smiling at what he saw. On the same day, the show was visited by Jiang Fen, chairman of the China Arts Association and dean of the Central Academy of Fine Arts. He was a veteran of the political struggles of the 1930s and 40s and had been repeatedly imprisoned for his fealty to the Communist Party. After the founding of the People's Republic, he had pioneered the teaching of oil painting and the expansion of art education beyond the universities into high schools. But after the 100 Flowers campaign, he was labeled a rightist, stripped of his posts, and sent into exile. Like Liu Xing, he had only just returned to Beijing. When he stood among the young artists and their works that day, he only had 3 more years to live, and he acted like he knew it. He was excited and had no intention of discouraging the stars. "Art exhibitions in the open air are a fine thing," he declared. "One can exhibit inside an art gallery, and one can also exhibit outside the gallery. Artists rise from within the art academy, as well as from outside it." He then briskly instructed the museum curators to accommodate the stars' works within the official grounds, where they would be safer. That night the stars partied on Beijing beer and ergot and pooled their funds to buy bowls of cabbage noodles. Their friends from today toasted their success. The second day of the exhibition went as well as the first. Hundreds of people were stopping by to see the stars' works, and the others arriving for the official exhibition at the museum also came over to loiter in the sun and pore over the works. It was like a dream. Then they woke up. On the morning of September 29th, Huang Rui arrived at the exhibition to find all the billboards for their show torn down. In the park was a group of provocateurs who had taunted the artists and the others who had gathered to see the show. Earlier that morning, the local Public Security Bureau, China's police force, had sent 100 officers to the National Art Museum to seize the works and post a notice that the exhibition had been banned. The edict was backdated to the opening day, September 27th, to make the show look doubly illegal. Liu Xing was appalled. He invited the stars to meet with him at the Huafangjai, a beautiful pavilion in Beihai Park to the northwest of the Forbidden City. Beihai had once been part of the imperial pleasure gardens built around the capital's northern lake, but had been opened to the public after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. The pavilion where the stars went to meet Liu Xing was beautifully decorated and built around a lily pond. Wang Keping remembered later that the lilies were beginning to shrivel as autumn was drawing in, but the water was still sparkling. It was here that the Beijing Artists Association had their official exhibition space in 4 separate halls built around the courtyard. Liu Xing took the artists through the calendar for Huafangjai and offered them a date later in the year. They accepted and tried to see it as a victory. After all, a few weeks earlier there had been no place for them in the official schedule, and now they had a chance to hang their work in one of the loveliest spaces in the capital. It was a big step up from the park railings in the open air. Yet, as they left, they couldn't help feeling it was the wrong call. They met that night with their friends from Today and the editors of the other unofficial journals like April 5th Form, run by their friend Liu Qing. The editors had been excited by the Star's success, especially because the arrest of Wei Jingcheng and the muzzling of Democracy Wall had cast a pall over the reform movement. Somehow the compromise of the Huafangjai show didn't seem enough. After all, Liu Qing argued, the Stars had done nothing illegal in the first place. Didn't the Constitution protect freedom of speech, publication, association, assembly, and demonstration? In the Stars' case, Liu Qing saw a chance to make a stand. He and his co-editor, Xu Wenli, suggested they hold a demonstration on National Day, October 1st. Huang Rui argued against it. He wasn't scared, he said later. It was just that he hated politics and preferred the quicksilver path they had taken to date. In his view, artists should use art to win. But the others disagreed. Wang Keping felt they had a responsibility to speak up for others. They had to make a stand for artistic freedom with their exhibition, and they could not just roll over now. Ma Deshang also argued strongly for a public protest. Outnumbered, Huang Rui agreed. And so they began to plan the first demonstration for freedom of speech ever held in the People's Republic of China. Once committed, Huang Rui realized that as one of the founders of the Stars, he must take a leading role. They drafted a declaration condemning the Public Security Bureau's actions and requesting that the Beijing government correct them. The next morning, they posted their declaration on Democracy Wall and sent a copy to the Beijing Communist Party Committee. Another copy was sent to the highest legal authority in Beijing, giving notice that the Stars intended suing the Public Security Bureau for infringing their rights. That afternoon, their patron Liu Xing came to beg them not to go ahead. After his long years in jail, he knew only too well where this could all lead. But the Stars were too fired up to back off. Together they decided on the slogans for their march. Liu Qing, the co-editor of April 5th Forum, proposed, "Fight for political democracy. Fight for artistic freedom." Wang Keping wisely counseled against parading the word fight through the streets, and they agreed that Liu Qing's banner should say, "We want political democracy. We want artistic freedom." The next morning, October 1st, they gathered in the rain at Democracy Wall. Huang Rui read the text of their complaint, and then Ma Deshang, wearing his trademark worker's cap, issued a vociferous call for action. Before the march, he had emptied his pockets of everything he owned and said goodbye to his parents, not knowing when he might see them again. Before they commenced, Huang Rui made one final gesture to art over politics. He had created a Stars logo, a stylized red rocket shooting through a blue sky and piercing the moon. He fashioned it into fabric badges and fixed one on the jacket of each of the Stars, a statement of their allegiance to a new ideal. With the big crowd falling in behind them, they set off, Huang Rui and Wang Keping in the lead, with Ma Deshang swinging along beside them on his crutches, his hair matted by rain and exertion. With them marched Beidao and Meng Ke, and their friends Liu Qing and Xu Wenli, along with the editors of all the main unofficial magazines. The whole nascent push for freedom of expression in China was on the move. They had planned to head up Chang'an Avenue to the Beijing government headquarters, but a police cordon blocked their way, so they took a winding route to their destination, singing the national anthem of the People's Republic and the International. By the time they reached the government headquarters an hour later, their ranks had swelled to 1,000. Once there, Ma Desheng addressed the crowd again, speaking of the need for democracy. Xu Wenli, the co-editor of April 5th Forum, also called for democracy and denounced the abuses of power he had seen. All the speakers pointed out that the new Constitution of 1978 guaranteed their rights of freedom of speech, assembly, and association. These were the rights that would be pointed to over and over in the years to come. Among those inspired by the Star's action that day was a young Liu Xiaobo, a student at the time. In an article published 30 years later, he would draw a direct line from the events of that day in 1978 to the resurgent movement for human rights in China in the Olympics year of 2008. He too pointed to the words in the Chinese Constitution that were in such conflict with the actions of the leadership. By the end of 2008, he was under arrest, and 12 months later, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison for inciting subversion of state power. In 2010, he became the only Chinese citizen to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. At the end of their demonstration, the Stars and their friends flung hundreds of copies of their statement into the sky to drift into the hands of the crowd. That night, they celebrated the news from Liuxing that their exhibition would be allowed to reopen at the Huafangzai on November 23rd. It was the third time that the little group around Huang Rui had made history, first with the publication of Today, then the Stars exhibition, and finally the National Day demonstration for freedom of expression. In those early days of Deng Xiaoping's China, it seemed that making history was something that the young and brave could get used to doing. But then, just 2 weeks later, Wei Jingsheng was brought to trial. When Wei Jingsheng's trial began at the Beijing Intermediate Court on October 16th, he was charged with selling state secrets to foreigners and engaging in counter-revolutionary agitation. It was a double charge of treason. In such a situation, there was never any doubt about the verdict. Wei's requests for witnesses to speak on his behalf were ignored, and his lawyer was never given a copy of the indictment or told when the trial would take place. So Wei defended himself. There is a photograph of Wei in court, his head shaved as if he had already been found guilty, his face bent to his notes. It captured his situation well, the hopelessness of his position, and the indomitable, studious determination he brought to handling it. The evidence of selling state secrets came down to the transcript of Wei's interview with Reuters in early 1979, in which he talked freely about the Sino-Vietnamese War. Wei argued that nothing he said came from any special source other than the common rumor in Beijing, and the details he provided, such as the name of the commander of the Chinese forces, could hardly have caused any strategic harm. In summing up, he said, "First, I had no intention of betraying the motherland. Second, I supplied the enemy with nothing at all. Third, I gave my friends no official secrets, either national or military. Thus, the prosecution's accusation that I committed treason is unfounded." His defense took no account, of course, of what a sensitive subject the botched Chinese campaign against Vietnam was, particularly as it had been Deng Xiaoping's pet project. On the charge of counter-revolution, Wei took a bolder line, arguing that as full democracy must be the ultimate aim of revolution, it was those who imprisoned him who were the counter-revolutionaries, not he. It was his duty as a citizen to critique and discuss the system. If one insists on hearing pleasant criticism only and demand its absolute accuracy on pain of punishment, this is as good as forbidding criticism and banning reforms altogether. Which, of course, was the point. Deng, like Mao, was only interested in criticism as a means to an end that he already had in mind. It was fine to let 100 flowers bloom occasionally to fight off opposition in the party or advance your own agenda. But in the end, neither Mao nor Deng was interested in a running commentary from the masses. Leadership was for leaders. Although Wei's trial seemed a preordained exercise of power by a monolithic state, the reality was more complicated. Like so many of the events of that period, the Wei Jingsheng episode exposed leadership tensions over freedom of expression that would resonate for years to come. We now know that Hu Yaoban, a protege of Deng and his later choice for General Secretary of the Communist Party, argued against punishing Wei Jingsheng. The lead editor of People's Today at the time and a longtime collaborator of Hu Yaoban wrote later that Hu had argued for Wei's rights following his arrest, stating, "I support anyone exercising their democratic rights under a socialist system. I hope everyone can enjoy the greatest freedom under the protection of the Constitution."